There is a room in Egypt so far underground that for 2,000 years, almost no one was allowed inside. It sits beneath the floor of a temple in the desert north of Luxor. You reach it through a narrow slot in the stone, barely wide enough for one person to turn sideways and slide through. And carved into the wall of that hidden chamber, in perfect, unblemished relief, is an object that should not exist. A tall, rounded shape, like a glass bulb stretched to the size of a man. Inside it, a long snake, running to the base of the bulb, a cable. And under the whole thing, a figure kneeling, holding it up like a battery in a cradle. It looks like a lamp. It looks exactly like a lamp. A modern electric lamp, drawn by people who died more than 15 centuries before Thomas Edison was born. Most people who tour that temple never see it. It is not on the main route. It sits in the dark, below the painted halls, in a crypt the priests kept sealed. But the people who have seen it, who have stood in front of that wall with a flashlight, describe the same feeling. A cold drop in the stomach. Because you are not looking at a god or a king or a battle. You are looking at what appears to be a piece of technology, and every instinct you have is telling you it is out of place by thousands of years. This is the Dendera relief. And the reason it has haunted people for over a century is not the picture alone. It is the ceiling above it. The ceilings of these deep Egyptian chambers, carved and painted with obsessive detail in total darkness, are clean. No soot, no smoke stains, no black scars from torches burning for the years it took to cut this art into solid rock. Somehow, the workers who made this saw what they were doing. And no one has ever fully explained how. So here is the question this entire investigation is built on. Did the ancient Egyptians have light without fire? And if they did, where did the power come from? For decades, that question got laughed out of the room. But the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Because this carving is not alone. There is a second object, dug out of the ground 1,000 miles away, that people have plugged in and switched on. There is a lost method for lighting the inside of a mountain that mainstream scientists now quietly admit the Egyptians probably used. And there is a modern experiment published this year that took an ancient artifact everyone called a fake and got over 1.4 volts out of it. Enough to run a current, enough to plate gold, enough to change the story. We are going to take the picture apart piece by piece. The bulb, the snake, the cable, the clean ceiling. And by the end, you will understand exactly what the Egyptians drew on that wall and why the real answer is stranger than the light bulb ever was. Let us start with the wall itself, because the details matter, and the details are where the mystery lives. The temple is at Dendera, on the west bank of the Nile, in what was once the sacred city the Egyptians called Unet. The building you can walk through today is late. It was raised during the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last line of pharaohs, and finished under a Roman emperor named Tiberius, which puts the final carving somewhere around the 1st century. But that late date is a trap, because Dendera was not built on empty ground. There was a temple here in the time of Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid, more than 2,000 years before the walls we see now. The site is old. The knowledge carved into it may be older still. The relief we care about is not in the grand halls upstairs. It is hidden in the crypts. These are secret passages built into the thickness of the temple walls and floor, so tight and so dark that they were used to store the most sacred objects, the gold statues of the gods, brought out only for festivals. The Egyptians thought of these crypts as a version of the underworld itself. And on the south wall of one of them, cataloged by researchers as Crypt 1C, is the most famous version of the image. A serpent, rising inside a great teardrop shape, held up by a pillar with human arms. When you first see it, the electrical reading writes itself. The teardrop is the glass envelope of a bulb. The snake inside is the glowing filament, the thin wire that heats up and shines. The pillar with arms is a stand or an insulator holding the whole thing off the ground. The line running to the base is a wire, a cable, and the box at the end of that wire is the power source, the battery. Every part of a working lamp is there, in the right order, in the right relationship, carved by people who had never, as far as we know, seen a lamp. That is the detail that unsettles people. It is not that the image looks vaguely like a bulb. It is that it looks like a wiring diagram. The current has somewhere to come from and somewhere to go, and a baboon crouches beside one version of the scene, holding two knives as if guarding it. Even the way the figure cradles the object, from underneath, palms flat, is the posture of a person handling something heavy and precious and possibly dangerous. A Norwegian electrical engineer was, by many accounts, the first person to look at it and say out loud what everyone was thinking. It looks like a Crookes tube, an early kind of vacuum lamp from the dawn of electrical science. Two Austrian writers, Peter Krasse and Rainer Habeck, turned that idea into a whole book titled in German, The Light of the Pharaohs. And then the most famous name in ancient mysteries, Erich von Däniken, the man who wrote Chariots of the Gods, put the image in front of millions of readers and never let it go. The absence of soot in the tombs, he and others argued, was the proof. No smoke meant no fire. No fire meant something else, something electric. Now here is where a serious investigation has to slow down, because the Egyptologists have an answer for every single piece of that image, and their answer is not nonsense. It is written on the wall next to the carving, in their own words. Here is the mainstream translation of that snake. It is not a filament, it is a god named Harsamtis, a form of the falcon god Horus, who in Egyptian myth is shown as a serpent rising up out of a lotus flower at the moment of creation. The teardrop bulb is not glass. It is the lotus flower opening, and in some readings, the womb of Nut, the goddess of the sky and of the night, out of which the sun is reborn each morning. The pillar with the little arms has a name too. It is the djed pillar, one of the most common symbols in all of Egypt, a sign of stability and the backbone of the god Osiris. And the cable, the smoking gun, the wire. In the Egyptian reading, it is a boat, a sacred barge that carries the serpent god across the sky. And the inscription itself, the caption, the Egyptians carved right beside the image, does not say anything about fire or light or power. It reads, in translation, as words spoken by Harsamtis, the great god who dwells in Dendera, the living soul in the lotus flower of the day barge, whose perfection is raised up by the two arms of the djed pillar. It even lists the material the object was made of, gold and various precious stones, and it gives a height. On the south wall, 3 palms tall. On the north wall, a matching figure carved from gold, 1 cubit high. Those are the measurements of a temple statue, not a machine. The Egyptians were telling us, in writing, right next to the picture, that this was a golden idol of a god about 1/2 meter tall, carried in a sacred boat during a festival. Not a lamp, a god. That is a powerful piece of evidence, and it deserves to be taken seriously. The people who made the carving left us a note explaining what it was, and the note says nothing about electricity. So, on the surface, the case is closed. The light bulb is a snake, the wire is a boat, and the whole thing is a creation myth. For decades, that was the official end of the conversation. Scholars dismissed the electrical reading as fantasy and moved on, but that explanation has a problem. In fact, it has 3. And the first one is sitting right above your head, the ceiling. Here is the fact that will not go away, no matter how neatly the snake explains the wire. To carve and paint the interior of these temples and the deep tombs in the Valley of the Kings, workers spent months, sometimes years, in absolute darkness, cutting precise, delicate, perfectly colored art into stone, with no window and no sunlight anywhere near them. Any open flame that gave them enough light to do that work would have thrown up smoke. Smoke leaves carbon. Carbon coats the ceiling black. It is unavoidable. Burn a candle in a closed room for a week and look at the wall above it. And yet, in many of these chambers, the ceilings are clean. The paint is bright. There are almost no soot stains from the original construction. The obvious question, the one that cracked this mystery open in the first place, is brutal in its simplicity. If they were not using fire, what were they using to see? That single question is why the light bulb theory has survived over 100 years of ridicule. It is not really about the picture. It is about the physics of a dark room. And it demands an answer that mainstream archaeology for a long time simply did not have. This is the first clue. Hold on to the clean ceiling, because we are going to come back to it, and the real answer is going to surprise you more than the fake one. Now for the second clue. And this is the one that takes the whole thing out of the realm of pictures on a wall, because you can hold it in your hand, you can pour liquid into it, you can wire it up to a meter and watch the needle move. In 1936, workers laying a railway foundation in a village called Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad in modern Iraq, broke into an old tomb. Inside were several small clay jars. Unremarkable, the kind of thing a dig throws in a crate and forgets. They went to the National Museum in Baghdad, and 2 years later, in 1938, the German director of that museum, a man named Wilhelm Koenig, pulled one of them off a shelf and noticed something the workers had missed. The jar was about 13 centimeters tall, small enough to fit in your palm, a plain buff yellow clay pot. But it was not empty, and it was not simple. Inside sat a cylinder made from a rolled sheet of copper, about 9 centimeters tall, its seam soldered shut with a lead and tin alloy. That detail alone is telling. You do not solder a seam to hold a scroll. You solder a seam to hold liquid. And suspended down the center of that copper tube, not touching the sides, held apart, was a single iron rod. The top was sealed with a plug of asphalt, the black bitumen that seeps naturally out of the ground across Mesopotamia. When it was opened, the iron rod was heavily corroded, eaten away by something acidic. Line those parts up, and an engineer sees a specific shape. 2 different metals, copper and iron, which sit at different points on the scale of electrical potential, a barrier keeping them from touching. An acidic residue where an electrolyte would go. A sealed, insulated container. That is not a vague resemblance to a battery. That is the exact recipe for 2 dissimilar metals, plus an acid, plus a way to keep them apart, is the entire working principle of the cell in your phone, scaled down and made of clay. Koenig looked at that arrangement. 2 different metals, held apart, sealed in a jar, one of them attacked by acid, and he saw something no archaeologist is supposed to see. He saw a battery. In 1938, he published a paper suggesting these jars were galvanic cells, simple electric batteries, and that the Parthian craftsmen who made them had used the current to electroplate a thin layer of gold onto silver. If he was right, it meant someone had built a working battery more than 1,000 years before Alessandro Volta officially invented the thing in 1800. For years, the response was that it was a coincidence, a scroll jar, a container, a clever-looking accident. But then people did the one thing you can do with a battery that you cannot do with a myth. They built copies and switched them on. Here is where it gets strange. In 1940, an engineer at the General Electric High Voltage Laboratory named Willard Gray made a working replica, filled it with copper sulfate solution, and drew about half a volt out of it. It was small, but it was real. The needle moved. Decades later, in 1978, an Egyptologist named Arne Egebrecht built his own version at a museum in Germany, poured in nothing more exotic than grape juice, and reportedly used the current to lay a thin film of gold onto a small silver statue over the course of several hours. Think about what that means. A clay pot designed and sealed 2,000 years ago, running a real electric current, doing real, useful, visible work, plating one metal onto another. The exact use Koenig had guessed. And it did not stop there. Just this year, a new study went back to the original design and found something everyone had missed. The old replicas were wired wrong. When rebuilt correctly, the researchers reported, the artifact behaves like two batteries in one, and it can push out over 1.4 volts. Not a trickle. Not a fluke. Enough current to electroplate metal, to etch a surface, even to split water. The device everyone had spent decades calling a fake turned out to be more capable than the people who called it a fake ever tested. And here is the part the confident debunkers tend to skip. The original jars from Kujut Rabu were dug up by railway workers, not archaeologists. The context, the layer of earth they came from, the objects around them, was never properly recorded. That messy discovery is exactly why the date is now disputed, with some experts pushing it later, into the Sassanid era, centuries after Koenig first guessed. But notice what that argument does. It moves the date around. It never explains away the object. The jar still exists, the metals are still there, the acid corrosion is still on the rod, and when you build it right, it still makes electricity. The mystery did not shrink. It just got harder to pin to a single year. If this is your first time seeing how close the ancient world came to electricity, this is the kind of investigation this channel runs every week. So consider subscribing before we get to the part that ties the jar in Baghdad to the wall at Dendera, because that is the real problem. A working battery in Iraq, a picture that looks like a lamp in Egypt, a dark room with a clean ceiling. Separately, each one has an explanation. Together, they start to look like the scattered pieces of a single lost idea. And the people who built the jar and the people who carved the wall were not as far apart as the map makes them look. The Dendera temple we see was finished under Roman rule, in the same broad window of history when the Baghdad jars were made. This was one connected ancient world. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the empires between them traded goods, fought wars, and swapped knowledge across those same centuries. Craftsmen moved. Ideas moved with them. An electrical trick discovered in one place did not have to stay there. A method for plating gold, a way to make metal shimmer without hammering it, would have been worth more than the gold itself, and worth keeping secret. And gold plating is the thread that quietly ties both ends of this story together. The one job everyone agrees the Baghdad jar could actually do is electroplating, laying a whisper-thin coat of gold onto a cheaper metal. Now, look back at what the Dendera inscription said the sacred object was made of. Gold. The temples of Egypt were drowning in gilded surfaces, statues, and shrines. Far more gold-covered objects than raw gold should have allowed. Where did all that gilding come from? The mainstream answer is hammering and heat. But a quiet electric method would have looked to anyone not in on the secret exactly like magic. But there is a catch with the Baghdad jar, and honesty demands we say it plainly. Half a volt, even 1.5 volts, is not much. To light a room the way a modern bulb does, you would need many of these jars wired together, and no one has ever found a wire, a lamp socket, or a workshop full of linked cells anywhere in the ancient world. The battery is real, the power grid is not, so it cannot, on its own, explain the clean ceiling at Dendera. Something is still missing. Which brings us to the third clue. And this is the one that finally makes the pieces fit, not by proving the light bulb was real, but by revealing the thing the Egyptians actually did, which almost no one talks about. Go back to the dark chamber. Go back to the impossible question. How do you light a room deep inside solid stone, well enough to paint a masterpiece, without burning anything? The answer the Egyptians left us is not a battery. It is a mirror. The Egyptians were among the finest metalworkers of the ancient world, and they made mirrors, beautiful ones, discs of polished bronze and copper alloy set on carved handles, some finished so brightly that ancient writers said they shone almost like gold. To the Egyptians, a mirror was not a vanity item. It was a sacred object, tied to the sun, to the goddess Hathor, the very goddess this temple at Dendera was built to worship, and to the soul itself. They believed a mirror could even hold the soul, the ka, of the person who owned it. That is how seriously they took a polished piece of metal. And it turns out these discs may have had a second job, one hidden in plain sight. For 3,000 years, a job so ordinary and so practical that it got written out of the story entirely, leaving only the myth behind. You place one polished mirror at the mouth of the tomb, angled to catch the blazing Egyptian sun, which pours down over that desert almost every day of the year. It throws a bright beam down the entrance shaft, deeper in. At the first bend, you place a second mirror to catch that beam and turn it around the corner. Then a third at the next turn. A chain of angled mirrors, each one passing the sunlight to the next, can carry daylight hundreds of feet into the heart of a mountain. No flame, no smoke, no soot, just the sun, folded around corners and poured into a sealed room. There is a real objection here, and it is worth facing. Critics point out that Egyptian mirrors were copper or bronze, not silver glass, and that each bounce loses some of the light. Chain too many together, and the beam fades to nothing. That is true if the metal is dull, but it comes down entirely to the polish. A copper alloy buffed to a mirror finish reflects far more than a tarnished one, and the Egyptians were obsessive polishers. New scientific work on their mirrors shows the metal was often worked to a bright, near-silver sheen. People have tested the idea, in real tombs, using nothing more than polished sheets angled in sunlight, and the light reaches surprisingly deep. It does not need to reach every chamber. It needs to reach the working surface long enough and bright enough to paint by. And a steady, cool beam of daylight is a far better light to paint fine detail by than a smoking, flickering torch that eats the oxygen in a sealed room and coats everything in carbon. This is not fringe speculation anymore. It is the leading, grounded explanation for why the deepest chambers in the Valley of the Kings, covered wall to wall in flawless painting, show so little smoke damage from their construction. The precision of that art, the fine detail far from any opening, is almost impossible to produce by the flicker of a torch. It needs steady, clean, bright light. Reflected sunlight is exactly that. The engineers who painted the tomb of Seti I almost certainly worked by mirror light, not fire. And now look back at the Dendera wall with that in mind. There is a modern theory argued in real detail by a designer studying the optics of the relief. That says the bulb shape everyone reads as a glass envelope is actually the side profile of a curved concave mirror, a polished bronze reflector, drawn the only way Egyptian flat art could draw a three-dimensional dish. Not a lamp, a light-throwing instrument. The Egyptians could not blow a giant glass tube, but they were masters of the polished metal disc. Seen that way, the whole scene stops being a battery and a filament, and becomes something the Egyptians genuinely possessed, a device for taking light and sending it where there was none. So here is where we have to be honest with you, the way any real investigation has to be, before we go to the final question. Does any of this prove the ancient Egyptians had electric light? No, it does not. There is no wire, no generator, no socket, no burned out bulb in any Egyptian dig. The snake on the wall really is described in the Egyptians' own writing beside it as the god Harsamptus in his lotus. The djed pillar really is a symbol of stability. The Baghdad Battery is real, but it is weak. It comes from a different place and a later time, and there is no chain of them powering anything. The most likely truth is that the Egyptians lit their tombs with a combination of clever things. Polished mirrors throwing sunlight around corners. Oil lamps burning clean fuels like castor oil, which give off almost no smoke when the wick is trimmed right. And centuries of restoration and cleaning that removed what little soot there was. That is the grounded answer. And here is the thing people miss. The grounded answer is still astonishing. Because it means these people, working with copper tools and rope and polished metal, understood optics well enough to carry sunlight into the belly of a mountain and paint by it. It means they understood chemistry and metallurgy well enough that a few hundred miles away, someone built a jar that generates a real electric current, by accident or on purpose, 1,000 years before Europe caught up. It means the ancient world was brushing right up against forces we think of as ours, as modern, as recent, and describing them the only way they could, in the language of gods and serpents and sacred light. And if even part of that is true, our history is missing a chapter. Not a chapter about aliens or lost supercivilizations, a quieter, more disturbing one. A chapter about how much ancient people actually knew and how much of it we threw away. Knowledge is fragile. A technique that lives in the hands of a few temple priests, never written plainly, guarded as sacred, dies the moment those priests die. A method for throwing light around corners becomes a picture of a mirror god no one can read. A recipe for a plating cell becomes a curious jar in a crate. The knowledge does not vanish because it was never real. It vanishes because it was never shared. And that is a far more human tragedy than any fantasy of lost machines. The mystery was never really whether they plugged something into a wall. The mystery is how close they came without one. And that leaves one last question hanging over the whole thing. The one that keeps people coming back to that dark crypt at Dendera. If the snake is only a god and the bulb is only a lotus, why did they hide it? Why is this image, out of everything the Egyptians carved, tucked away in a sealed crypt, in the deepest, most secret passage of the temple, in a room compared to the underworld itself, meant to be entered by almost no one? The reliefs upstairs, the public gods, the kings and the offerings, are out in the open. This one is buried. Whatever the Egyptians thought they were drawing, they treated it as knowledge for the very few. And they sealed it in the dark on purpose. We can translate the words next to it. We can explain the snake and the pillar and the boat, but we cannot ask the people who cut it into the wall why they thought this particular image belonged in the most hidden room they built. They took that answer with them. The temple at Dendera is still there. You can fly to Luxor, drive north along the Nile, and stand in that crypt today with a light in your hand. The bulb is still on the wall, exactly where they left it. The snake is still rising out of the flower. The clean ceiling is still overhead, refusing to explain itself. And the polished mirrors that may have lit it all are scattered in museum cases around the world, labeled as makeup accessories, their real trick forgotten. If you want to see what other machines and impossible objects the ancient world left buried in the dark, the next investigation is already waiting for you on screen right now. Watch it. Because the deeper you look, the less finished this story becomes.